In this video, I want to go over the Greek text of Romans 8:18 through 39. This is the final section before we get into the last section of the first half of Romans. And so this rounds out Paul's discussion about various ways, various things that impact the justified believer. So in Romans 6, he talked about the believer's relationship to sin. In Romans 7, the believer's relationship to the law. And then in Romans 8, the believer's relationship to the spirit and flesh. In Romans 18 and through the remainder of the chapter through 39, he really kind of riffs off of what he introduced in verse 17. And so in Romans 8:17, he poses this conditional statement. If we are children and heirs, then we are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. And just as we suffer together with Christ in order that we might be glorified together with Christ. And so this idea of suffering and glory kind of come from the last verse that we see in 8, 1 through 17. So he's going to talk a lot about how our present suffering will result into future glory. And this sounds very similar to another section that we saw in Romans 5, 1 through 11. Which talks about the expectation that we have of having been justified. And Paul states in Romans 5, 1 through 11, that we should anticipate suffering, and we do suffer, but the idea is that this present suffering, through the suffering, we look forward to the salvation that we have that comes from being justified. The passage is really broken up into two parts. The first part comes in verses 18 through 30, and the exegetical idea for this section could be something like believers are called upon to endure present suffering through the help of the Holy Spirit and to wait and hope for the incomparable future glory of final salvation guaranteed by God himself. And so even that exegetical statement sort of sounds like what we saw in Romans 5, 1 through 11. This section could be broken up into three parts. So 18 through 25, future glory is incomparable to the present suffering, as demonstrated in the hope for the final redemption found in creation and in believers. And then the second part is that the Spirit intercedes for the believer and helps them overcome their present weakness. So even though we're looking forward to a future hope and a future glory, the Spirit currently in the present time intercedes for the believer and helps them. And then the third part, in verses 28 and 30, God works all things for the good of all believers to accomplish his predetermined goal for them to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. And so we'll talk more about 8:28 in particular. That seems to be pretty keen proof text that all things will just work out because God does that for those who love him. But we'll see what the good means when we get to that passage. It doesn't necessarily mean comfortable or grand. It usually involves some level of suffering. The second part of the passage in verses 31 through 39 concludes this section, and an exegetical idea might be believers are secure in Christ on account of God's love from which nothing in space or time can separate them. We can break up this section into four parts. The first part is in verses 31 and 32. Believers are secure since God the Father is on their side and acts for them. And then verse 33, believers are secure from all condemning charges because God has justified them. And then in verse 34, believers are secure since Jesus Christ has made and continues to make provision for them. And then 35 through 39, believers are secure because nothing in space or time can separate them from God's love. The passage begins in verse 18 where Paul makes a statement, and the verb here, the main verb that we have here is logizomai, I reckon. And so logizomai is going to assert something that Paul firmly is convicted of. And so hati is going to modify logizomai, so this gives us the content of his conviction. So therefore, I reckon that. And then we have this phrase here that has no verb, uk axia ta pethamata tu nun kairu. And so our genitive here is going to modify the nominative here. So idiomatically, this would be our present suffering. And then we have an adjective in the predicate position. So we have to supply the verb is. So Paul's conviction is that our present suffering is not worthy. And then pros introduces a comparison. And so we might translate pros as compared to or comparison with. And so our present suffering is not worthy in comparison to the glory. And so tain doxane, artain melusen doxane is our accusative. So we'll do a dotted underline. Our participle here is in the attributive position, so it's modifying doxin. And so tain melusen doxin we might translate in comparison to the coming glory. And then we have an infinitive here, which comes back and modifies doxin. It's functioning epexegetically, so it gives us a little bit more definition to what kind of doxin what doxin is. It's this glory which will be revealed to us. And so note the contrast. In the first part of his conviction, the suffering is present. And in the second half, we have melusen, and then also apokalypthenai, which points towards the future. And so our present suffering is outweighed by the hope of our future glory. So that's his thesis. The remainder of this portion, verses 18 through 25 and 19 through 25 specifically, gives a deeper explanation of why Paul holds this conviction. In verse 19, he begins with gar, and note here we have our nominative. We'll give it a single underline, and it's brought together with this genitive construction. So the eager expectation of creation, and then our verb epidexetai. We can give that a double underline. I've already marked it. And then our direct object, tein apokalypsen, tone weun to theu. And so we could put parentheses around this, and this is our a direct object. So we'll do a dotted underline. So putting all this together, this is the first line of explanation. For the eager expectation of creation waits the revelation of the sons of God. And so kind of this interesting idea, kind of a redundant idea. So the eager expectation eagerly awaits the revelation of the sons of God. If we come back and we look at this genitive construction here, the apokaradokia tes kitesios. Kitesios is going to be a subjective genitive. So this is the expectation that the creation is waiting for, and then our tone weon here is probably going to be an objective genitive, the revelation. When God reveals the sons of God. And so again, we have the nominal form of the verbal form that we saw in verse 18. And so it's the same kind of root. Again, this is future-oriented language with this eager expectation and waiting. type of language, the revelation. And so, in real ways, Paul can talk about believers as being justified, having been justified. We are currently sons of God, or if we wanted to make it a little bit more gender neutral, since this is a plural, masculine plural, children of God. In a very real way, having been justified, we are children of God. But in the future, when we come into consummation, we will be fully revealed as sons of God. And at that point where the adoption is fulfilled and complete. Verses 20 and 21, which make up a complete sentence in Greek, really answers the question that Paul raises in verse 19. Why would the creation be eagerly awaiting the revelation of the sons of God? And so we get the explanation here with Gar, and so he introduces the explanation with Gar. And then here's our nominative, he katesis. So we'll give it a single underline. For creation was subjected to futility. And so I should give it a dotted underline here. Probably we might take this idea of futility here to be a dative of sphere or condition. So this idea of futility describes the current state of creation. And then he goes on, not willingly, and our ekousa is, I'm treating that as a structural marker, but I'm wrong there. That line should be omitted. But it describes how the creation was submitted. They were submitted not willingly, and then the contrast, but through the one who subjected it. And so here we have a substantival participle. And so we're not super clear on who subdued creation. And so some options might be Adam. Adam could be the culprit. Another option might be Satan. But probably the best option might be God himself. And so God who subdued creation at Genesis 3 at the fall. And so I think this is probably a reference to God who is subjecting the creation, but he is subjecting creation FLPD in hope. And our hati clause down here is going to be linked back to LPD. It describes what this hope is, and so it's going to provide the content of the hope. Kai alte he katesis elu therothesatai. And so here is our nominative alte he katesis. Note here that we have the predicate use of alte, so this is going to be the intensive form of alte. So creation itself will be freed. And note here we've got a future passive. And so this is probably a divine passive. So it's God who's is the one who's going to free creation, which probably lends itself to option number 3 for the one who subjected it. So creation itself will be freed from the slavery of decay, and so apa, and then into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The teknon to theou links back to what we saw in verse 19, the weon to theou, so the children of God, the sons of God, it's the same group of people. And so we need to work through some of these genitive chains here. So from the slavery of decay, or the bondage of decay, we could take thoros as an objective genitive. If it's objective genitive, we might translate this bondage that leads to corruption. Or we could take it as a subjective genitive, and in that case, we might translate it as corruption that imposes bondage. And so the bondage then becomes the direct object of the verbal idea that's in the head noun. Or we could take it as a genitive of apposition. And so in that case, it might be bondage, comma, namely decay. And then the next genitive construction here, tain eleutherion tes doxes. And so a number of ways that we could take this genitive construction, freedom of glory. Could be a genitive of apposition, and so freedom, namely glory. It could be a subjective genitive, so glory that gives freedom, but it's probably an attributive genitive. And if it's an attributive genitive, then that genitive is going to function like an attributive adjective. So we might translate the phrase glorious freedom. And then that makes sense with the ton teknon. We might take ton teknon as a possessive genitive, so the freedom that these children of God possess, or it could be an objective genitive, so the glorious freedom given to the children of God, some kind of idea there. And so when you're dealing with these genitive chains, it can be somewhat difficult to kind of work out the syntax. Verses 22 and 23 go on and describe the travail that the creation finds itself in. Paul begins the sentence with gar, linking it to the context, and then we have this verb oidamen, we know. So this is a statement of something that Paul and the believers share. Hati here connects to oidamen, telling us what we know. We know that all creation is groaning and travailing until now. We get a little temporal marker here, but our two verbs, sustenadze and sun odine, and so both of these note we get the sun prefix. So they are groaning and travailing with us. And so there's some continuity between creation and the believers that Paul is dealing with here. And he's going to draw the believers in verse 23 together with creation. Note here that we have the predicate form of pasa heketesis. So all of creation are groaning and laboring until now. This word laboring refers to labor pains. And throughout the New Testament, even Old Testament literature, they'll describe this anxiously waiting for the end in terms of labor pains. And so this sense that there's going to be tension, there's going to be tribulation prior to the Lord's second coming. So this idea of labor pains looks forward to the end. And so we're still, he's describing, these are both present tense verbs. And so he's describing what's happening to creation right now, but he's looking forward to the future. And I should have mentioned it in verses 19 and 20, but this anguish that creation is feeling is an allusion to the fall in Genesis 3. And so when God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden and subjected creation to, it's because of their sin. And so the result of our sin is that creation is in the state that it is in. And so in verse 22, he's talking about creation, But in verse 23, he begins to talk about believers, and so he shifts to believers. And so we have this phrase, umanande alakai, and so this creates the contrast between creation and humanity. And actually, it's not really a contrast, but kind of a continuation, we might say. And so, but not only, but also. And then note here, we have a participial phrase. And we've got it indented because it's modifying our main verb. And so we have three verbs in 22 and 23. Our first two verbs, creation is the subject. And then in our third verb, hemes, which is a reference to the believer, is the subject. So hemes kai autoi. And note here, autoi is in the predicate position. So this is emphatic. And he's added kai here, so that makes it even more emphatic. And he actually begins our participial phrase with autoi. And so we have autoi mentioned twice. That makes it this really extremely emphatic. So he really wants to drive the point home. And so if we translate our main verb first, then we'll come back and pick up the participle. So we also ourselves even groan inwardly. And so in ourselves is this prepositional phrase. Note that the verb in verse 23 is identical to the verb in 22, except in 22 we have the soon prefix here. Here he drops the soon prefix. So, but not only does creation groan, but we ourselves groan within ourselves. And then we can come back and pick up this participial phrase. Note there's no article, so this is going to be adverbial. And this could be cause. And it gives us the reason why we groan. So because we have the first fruits, namely the Spirit, we ourselves groan within ourselves. Or it could be concession. And if we take it as concession, it concedes the point. So even though, so the concession keyword with concession would be, even though we have the first fruits of the Spirit, we ourselves groan in ourselves. And then we have our another participial phrase here. Eagerly awaiting adoption. And so this could be probably temporal. Note here, there's no article, so it's going to be adverbial. And this is going to mark be temporal. So we groan while we wait for adoption. And then the last accusative here, the redemption of our body, is an apposition to adoption. So what is this adoption that he's referring to? Well, he's referring to the redemption of our body. Interestingly, he discusses adoption. We get this language in Romans 8 in the previous section, 10 through 11. We saw this redemption language in Romans 3:24. And so we get this idea of redemption in Romans 3:24. And 3:24, Paul indicates that we have been redeemed. And it's the same thing that he says in Romans 8:15. for you have been adopted. And so earlier in these passages, he talks about adoption and redemption as real things that the believer experiences. But here in Romans 8:23, he refers to them as something that's future oriented. Verses 24 and 25 round out this section that compares our current suffering with the future glory that we're looking forward to. And just like what we saw in verse 19, when Paul describes creation as being subjected in hope, in 24 and 25, he's going to describe the hope that the believer has. And so, pretty paratactic section. So, a lot of short clauses here should be left on the left side of your structural marker. We get the car here, which gives us an explanation. Therefore, we are being saved. Note here that this is going to be an aorist passive form, and so this is going to be a divine passive. So God is the one who's saving us. But what's interesting is that it's used in the aorist tense, because all throughout this passage so far, he's used the future tense to talk about our future salvation. But here he uses the aorist tense, which seems to describe an action that's already been completed. And so what might this mean is that we might take this as a proleptic aorist. So looking forward, it's describing an action that's all but done. And then we have this dative here, te elpidi, that we need to think about. This is probably going to be a dative of association. And so we are being saved with hope. It's probably not going to be instrumental. The instrumental dative would indicate that we are being, hope is saving us. But this is probably going to be an association. So as we are being saved, hope is being given to us. We have hope. Hope is our companion with our salvation, as one commentator has described this dative here. And so the remainder of 24 and 25 are going to describe what hope is. And so we get hope, and then our participle blepomene is going to go back and modify hope. So hope that is seen is not hope. And our participle may indicate that this is hope that we've experienced, hope that something that we've come into contact. That's not really hope. And so, when it's late at night and I haven't had dinner and I'm hoping for dinner, that's an indication that I'm hungry. But if I'm eating dinner, there's this hope for dinner is no longer there. And so hope, by nature of what hope is, the thing is absent. So then he goes on and says, for our main verb here, this should be marked elpidze, and then tis is going to be our nominative. Who hopes for the thing that he sees? Therefore, who hopes for what he sees? And then the last description of what hope is: for if we hope what we do not see. And so this relative clause here, I've got it indented and above the line, above our protasis of our conditional sentence, but it should fit here with our ellipsis. So for if we hope for what we do not see, then we wait eagerly. And again, this should be marked. These verbs should be marked. We eagerly await through endurance, or steadfast endurance. And so our word here for steadfast endurance, hupomones, reminds us of Romans 5, 2 through 5. And in that section, Paul gives us this string of verbs. And so we boast in, back in 5:2, verse 2, therefore we also stand in access by faith in this grace which we stand, in which we boast, in the hope of the glory of God. Not only this, but also we boast in our tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces steadfastness, and steadfastness, character, and character produces hope. And then in verse 5, and this hope does not disappoint. And so what we have here in verse 24 and 25 seems to be parallel to what he's saying in Romans 5:2-5. Verses 26 and 27 shift gears. This is another part to this first section, which describes the Spirit's intercession for the believer and the Spirit's help for them to overcome their weakness. And so 26 and 27 really kind of the centerpiece of this section. And then in 28 and 29 and 30, Paul rounds out this part before he moves to the conclusion of Romans 8. In the previous verse, we saw a participial phrase that made reference to the Spirit. So I think that introduces the Spirit into the conversation, this idea of our present weakness, our present futility, our present travail. And so he's going to talk about the Spirit and the Spirit's aid for us. And so it begins with these conjunctions, but likewise also. So this chi here is probably going to be assensive, so also. And so just like what we were talking about in the previous section about the creation, now we are going to introduce ta pneuma, the Spirit. The Spirit aids our weakness. And so we might take this as the direct object. And then this phrase here, which begins with gar, shows us how he aids our weakness for, or why, for what we should pray. Note here, this is going to be our aorist subjunctive. And so this is probably going to be a deliberative. So what we should pray exactly as necessary, we do not know. And so we don't know how we should pray. We have the desire to pray in accordance to God's will, but we do not know what God's will is all the time. And so this is how the Spirit helps us. But the Spirit himself, note here, alta, is in the predicate position, so this is going to be intensive. So the Spirit himself intercedes with groans, and so this dative here is going to be instrumental. So this is how he intercedes for us. Could be means or manner as well. And so how does he intercede with us, for us? He intercedes with speechless groans. Note here that we have an alpha privative on a adjective with the la le root there, so speechless groans. And so it's interesting. You have creation groaning, and then in verse 25, you have the believers groaning. But now here in verse 26, you have the Spirit groaning. It's interesting when you compare these two, the groaning of the Christian, the groaning of creation. That's kind of a laborious groan, like, ugh. Here we have the Spirit who's groaning for us in terms of petition for the believer. And so he continues on in verse 27. We get this conjunction de with a substantival participle functioning as the subject. Our accusative here actually goes together with the participle. For the one who searches hearts knows, and then the T here tells us what we know, the mindset of the Spirit. And so this idea of phronema is linked back to Romans 8:6, the mindset of the Spirit. And then hati here is probably going to be causal, because he intercedes for the saints according to God. And so he intercedes on behalf of the saints. So we could take that for the saints or behalf of the saints. And then kata theon, according to God. This is probably more specifically according to God's will. And so in comparison to us, when we pray, we don't know what to pray. We don't know how to pray. But when the Spirit intercedes on our behalf, he's praying according to God's will. And so interesting contrast between the Spirit and us. And so in this passage in Romans 8, the thrust of Romans 8, we'll see in Romans 8:34, Christ actually intercedes for the believer. And here in 8:26, 8:27, we have the Spirit interceding for the believer. Verses 28 through 30 rounds out this section, this first part, which runs from Romans 8:18 through 30. This section begins by comparing the believer's current suffering with their future, with the hope of the future glory that they'll have when they become fully consumed as sons of God. And so Paul says it's not comparable. And so this hope that we have, that we can look forward to, helps us to endure our current struggles. In verses 26 and 27, the Spirit, he introduces the Spirit as one who intercedes for us and helps us overcome our present suffering. And then finally, in verses 28 through 30, he inserts God, and so God is actually going to help us in our current travail. And so here we go, very like we've seen in the previous passages. He begins verse 28 with oidamen. So oidamen indicates a conviction that he has, and then hati gives us the content of what we know. So, but what we know that, and then this is what we know. Tois agaposen tantheon panta sun erge es agathon. Tois kata prothesen kletois usen. And so tois agapesen tantheon, that's going to be one clause, that dative there. I'm going to give it a dotted underline, a double dotted underline. And then panta is accusative. Could be nominative and it could be accusative. Since it's plural and we're dealing with a singular verb here, I'm going to take panta as accusative. There's no nominative, so it's going to be embedded in that verb. And then es agathon is our prepositional phrase. And then tois kata prothesen kletois usen is dative, so I'll give it a double dotted underline. And so this is a participial phrase. That's a dative, present, active, participle, dative, masculine, plural form of eimi. And so that's going to be a substantival participle. This participial phrase is going to be an apposition to the dative indirect object, tois agaposin. So in our structural layout, we could have dropped tois kata prathesin, clay tois usin underneath that first clause there. So let's put all this together. For we know that he works all things, and then our dative here is probably a dative of advantage. And so we would translate it for the ones who love God. And then our prepositional phrase indicates purpose. And so he works all things for good. And then if we wanted to come back and pick up this participial phrase, which is an apposition to the first clause, for those who are called according to his purpose. And so this idea of purpose links into God's will. So we saw that kata theon in verse 27. And then our next hati clause is actually causal. And so this is going to give us the reason why God works all things together for those who love him. But before we look at the cause, let's come back and think through some of these words here, because I think this verse is misused quite a bit. So first of all, let's think through agathon. Agathon generally means good, and oftentimes we take that to mean good in terms of my own prosperity. And so, if I need to close on a house or find a parking spot or find a date or something along those lines, we tend to use this verse to indicate, hey, I love God, so God's going to do something for me. He's going to bless me. But think through the thrust of the passage. What Paul is looking forward to, it's not some kind of tangible benefit that he finds in this life. He's looking forward to being the full consummation of being a son of God, being adopted into the family. And so good here, I think Paul has an eschatological view in mind. And so I don't think he's thinking of something tangible here. And then also in the in the next clause where we have the cause here, we see what actually the good is. The good is that we become formed in the image of his son. And so good isn't necessarily getting a good grade on a paper or something along those lines. It's actually being conformed to the likeness of his son. And so I would argue that this confirmation or this conforming process that he describes here generally occurs in the midst of trials. And so it's not necessarily the happy life that Paul is looking forward to are presenting to the believer. Note here with our causal phrase here, we have a relative pronoun, and we'll see this relative pronoun repeated through verse 30 and 31. And so, whom he foreknew, he predestined into the image of his son. And then eis tahena is going to give us the purpose. And so why is he conforming us into the image of his son? So that he is the firstborn. So auton is going to be our subject of this infinitive. Pra to takon is going to be our accusative. And so he is the firstborn among many brothers. And so without mentioning it here, Paul is making an allusion to adoption. And so we are brothers with Christ. If we're brothers with Christ, that means then we are sons of God. And so we get this string here of relative clauses, for whom he predestined. And so that also goes back to this verb here. These he called. So and so the ones that he called, he predestined. And whom he called, so again, the link. These also he justified. And whom he justified, again, creates that link. These also he glorified. And so just real quickly, note that all of these verbs are aorist tense. And so it's not too remarkable that proridsen or et kalesen or even et dikaosen are in the aorist tense, because it describes something that's already occurred to the believer. But what's fascinating is that he puts doxazo in the aorist tense here. And so this is clearly referring to something that's in the future of the believer. And so we haven't been glorified. We're looking forward to glorification. And so he uses the aorist tense. So it's almost like he's saying this glorification is all but done. It's so sure I can put it in the aorist tense. And then also note the chain here that gives us assurance as well. So if he's preordained us, if he's called us, if he's justified us, then surely he will glorify us in the future. So it's kind of an interesting link between the passages. Romans 8:31 begins a new section that really runs through the end of the chapter in verse 39. We have the teun erumen, what will we say? And so it kind of introduces a new section. It flows from the previous section. In this section, Paul is going to reiterate the security that the believer has on account of God's love for them. And then he comes around with this artistic passage that nothing, absolutely nothing in the world, nothing in space or time can separate the believer from God's love. And so this first section in verses 31 and 32 describes the believer as secure since God the Father is on their side and acts for them. So it kind of dovetails with what we saw in verses 28, 29, and 30. So let's put all this together. Our first clause here, it's an independent clause. And note we have a question mark at the end. Therefore, what will we say about these things, or in view of these things? Namely, I think the Tauta goes back and to refer to our present suffering. And then our next clause, we have a conditional clause. And so since the clause begins with our conjunction we've indented it. This is a first-class conditional sentence. So if God is for us, we might be able to translate this, since God is for us, since this is true. I kind of like using if God is for us, since our conjunction is here. So if God is for us, who is against us? And so we have our contrasting prepositions huper and kata. So if God is for us, who is against us? And then our relative clause here. Now, I probably didn't do a great job here, but the antecedent of our relative clause is theos. And so if God is for us, who is against us? God, namely, who did not spare his own son. And so we get the negative here. He did not spare his own son, but handed him over for us all. And so this verb here, paradidomi, and really the verb here, to spare, points to the death of Christ. And we see a similar use of the verb in Romans 4, 23 through 25, describing the death of Christ. It's described, God is the one who's described as handing him over, namely handing him over to his death. Interestingly, in the Gospels, it's Judas who hands Jesus over. And so it's a technical term for betrayal, but then the New Testament picks up on it and uses it to refer to his own death. And then the last clause here, how will he not also give us all things to us with him? And so three conjunctions, how, not, also, and then our prepositional phrase, soon, alto. Here the referent is a referent to Christ, so with him. And so that's an allusion back to us being brothers with Christ, who is the firstborn. And so ta panta is going to be our accusative, and then hemen is going to be our dative direct object. So if God did not spare his own son for us, he's going to give us everything. And so he makes a similar move in Romans 5 when he's talking about if God's going to do this greater thing, then he's going to do the lesser thing for us as well. In verse 33 and 34, we get two more reasons why the believer is secure. The first comes in verse 33 with the question, who will press charges against the elect of God? Our genitive here is probably possessive, against God's elect. And then the response to this, and really the implied answer to this question, is no one. And the response is God is the one who justifies. And so we get this substantival participle. The verb is implied, and technically, since it has the article, we might say the one who justifies is God. And so we get courtroom language here. And so remember back in Romans 2 and Romans 3, who was the judge? God's the judge. So if anyone is going to press a charge, it would be God who presses the charge. But God has already declared us righteous. And so he is the one who justifies. And what's implied here with this participial phrase is he is the one who justifies us. And so the believer is secure from all condemning charges because God has justified us. And then the second reason the believer is secure is because what Jesus does. And so who will condemn us? So it's introduced with a second tis here, and actually a third tis because we get the first one in verse 32. Who will condemn us? Christ Jesus, who died, and so as substantival participle, but much more raised. And so this idea of death and resurrection, clarifying who Jesus is and what he does, giving him the power that he does to rule in our lives. Resurrection is key. And so that goes back to Romans 4, 23 through 25. And so that's what's important. And then we have two relative pronouns, has. Both of these, the antecedent goes back to Christos. Christ Jesus, who died, and much more, or rather, was raised, who is at the right hand of God, and who intercedes on behalf of us. So again, this is the same verb that Paul uses in verse 26. And so Christ is the one who intercedes for us. We saw earlier in the passage that the Spirit intercedes with on our behalf with wordless groans. And so why is Christ's intercession effectual? Well, it's because where he's located, at the right hand of God. Verses 35 and 39 give us the last reason why the believer is secure. And it's because nothing can separate the believer from the love that God has for them. And so just like what we've seen throughout this passage, beginning in 31, the sentence begins with tis. And so asking a question, who can separate us from the love of Christ? And then we get this long list of possible things that might separate us from Christ. And so persecution or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or even the sword. And so here I translated our first word, thalithus. It could be persecution, but here it probably means tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, or the sword. And note the repetition of the conjunction tends to create this pile-on effect. And then he ends this with another question. So I could probably put all of these over to the left hand of the margin. Can tribulation, distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or the sword separate us from the love of Christ? And the implied answer to both of these is no. On this slide, I actually have a typo here. It's 8:36 to 37. And so this is verse 37 down here. And so it begins verse 36, kathos gegreptais. That's a pretty standard introduction to the Old Testament, just as has been written that. And then what we have here is actually a citation of Psalm 44:22. And it's kind of an odd citation, but we'll translate it. For your sake, and the Sioux here, the referent is God. For God's sake, we are being put to death the whole day, or all the day, or all day long. We are being counted as sheep to the slaughter. And so I think the citation here just kind of points to the fact that believers ought to anticipate suffering. Suffering is something that the believer shouldn't be surprised about. And so just a quote from Calvin, who put it this way: it's no new thing for the Lord to permit his saints to be undeservedly exposed to the cruelty of the ungodly. And so all day long we are being put to death. We are being led as sheep to the slaughter. But then in 37, we get a contrasting conjunction. But in all these things, we have become more than conquerors. And so note here our verb nikomen. Nikeo is our root, and then we have huper, so we've become super conquerors, or maybe more than conquerors. And then the root here is where we get the name of the famous sports apparel, Nike. And so conquerors, the one who conquers. And so, in all these things, we have become more than conquerors through the one who loves us. And so, get a participial, substantival participial phrase. The one who loves us, namely God. And how does he love us? He loves us by sending his son to die on the cross. And so that expresses that love. Verses 38 and 39 round out this section, and it actually, you can tell here, we get this long laundry list of items that make up creation. It kind of creates an inclusio with what we have in verse 35. In verse 35, Paul asks the question, who can separate us from the love of God? And then he gives this laundry list of possibilities: tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or stress, or the sword. And so we get the same sort of list here in verse 38. It's a little bit longer, 38 and 39. But here, it's not a question anymore. It's a statement. And so he begins, I am confident that, and then we get our negators, neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor authorities. Here, the authorities, since it's in conjunction here with angels, the authorities probably refers to spiritual authorities. And so maybe demons or something along those lines. And then he shifts to a temporal element, nor things in the present, nor things to come. And so we see our root there, mellow, things to come, nor powers. Again, this is probably an emphasis on the spiritual powers, nor heights, nor depths, nor any other creature is able to separate us from the love of God. And so our main verb here, which goes back to our haughty, I'm confident that the list is not able to separate. And so this is going to be a complementary infinitive. From the love of God. And then this clause here is an apposition, the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. And so just kind of an interesting link to the previous section that we saw, which began in verse even 18. I was going to say 20, but probably even goes back even further to verse 18, where he talks about the creation. And so at the beginning of the passage, he talks about creation groaning and looking forward to the redemption of the sons of God. But here at the end of the passage, the creation, he describes creation as a dangerous place for the believer. And so the believer is in a dangerous area. And so this kind of gets to Paul's eschatology. And so let me create some space to draw. And so when we think about Paul's eschatology, we have the cross, and then we have what we might describe as the present age. This is the age that Paul lived in. It's the age that you and I live in. It's the church age. And then there is the age to come. And so the cross looks forward to this time. And so, in some ways, with the death of Christ, we've inaugurated this age to come, but we're still looking forward to the age to come. And so, this eschatological tension that Paul, I think, is in Paul's mind, kind of draws out throughout this entire passage from verse 18 to the end of 39, describes, hey, the situation that we're in, the present age that we're in right now, it's a dangerous place. But everything in this age is actually looking forward to the day of the Lord, where God makes things right, where the sons of God are fully realized and fully seen. The new heavens and the new earth. The earth is no longer subjected to futility, as it's described in earlier in Romans in 8:18 through 25.